Welcome, everyone, to this Prevent Connect podcast. My name is Tori Vandelin, and this is a really special podcast that we're bringing to you today because it is a conversation amongst Prevent Connect staff. So I am really excited to do this podcast with Ashley Klein Jimenez and David Lee. I'm going to be sitting in the hosting seat, and I'm really excited to ask Ashley and David all of these questions about, what we've experienced in 2021 and what we're looking forward to in 2022 for sexual and intimate partner violence prevention. Before we start, Ashley and David, can I ask you two to briefly introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Klein Jimenez, Director of Prevention at Valor US and Prevent Connect. And I'm excited for you to be asking me the questions today, Tori. It's a different seat than I'm used to sitting in for Prevent Connect podcast. And I'm really excited to be here with you and with David.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Tori. And it's great to be sitting here virtually with Ashley. I'm David Lee, and I'm with Valor US, and I'm also with Prevent Connect. And I had the great privilege of starting Prevent Connect when we started doing our first activities in 2005. And so it's really great. It's hard to believe it's almost 17 years now later, and I'm really looking forward to reflecting about and thoughts about where prevention stands today.
Gosh, if Prevent Connect were a human, it would be able to drive a car and start applying for colleges now. That is amazing to just reflect on how far we've come and how long Prevent Connect has been with its community. This is so great. The purpose of this podcast is for us to kind of discuss what happened in 2021. This podcast is coming out at the end of December 2021. Just wanted to wrap up the year with a nice bow and let folks know some of your insights, Ashley and David, into what's happened and what's to come. So 2021 is the first full year that the United States has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And with some of the news this week, it's evolving, it's still here. And, we're not really sure how much longer we'll still be in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last year, what were some ongoing and emerging challenges for sexual and intimate partner violence prevention?
While it's the first full year, it feels like a lifetime, or it's certainly been almost 2 years now, over a year and a half of this. There've been many ways that our prevention efforts have had many challenges. And one of them is access. It's really hard to be able to reach people. So much of our prevention was done in person, whether it was in schools or community settings or in sport, and that those are places that weren't meeting in person or were meeting or converted to meeting virtually. And even as people started regathering in person, that they've been more hesitant and being more careful about bringing other people in. So getting access to being with groups of people has been a real challenge. And I think that's been where I've heard a lot of prevention practitioners have to be really creative in how to be able to build that access. But the other part to me is the trauma of the experience of living through the pandemic, and it becomes yet another factor that we have to address. The fear of what's going to be happening, the trauma of people having major illnesses, and the reality of death that are affecting people throughout our communities, and not affecting all communities evenly, that it's disproportionately impacting poor and communities of color. And we see that this is a real challenge for us, that we have to deal with this trauma. And while the trauma might not be the trauma necessarily of sexual and domestic violence, it's still the trauma. And we're seeing the trauma of enhanced problems of sexual and domestic violence that are taking place, of people being trapped, are stuck within their homes and unable to be there, putting them at greater risk, the trauma of being more isolated and unable to seek support, of the greater risks that people are facing with this. And so I think that trauma has been there. So, Ashley, what else do you think of when you think of some of these challenges for doing sexual and intimate partner violence prevention?
Yeah, I mean, David, I really agree with your comments. And I think one thing that I have just really been thinking about, for the last almost 2 years is just how so many risk factors for violence, both experiencing it and, perpetrating it, have really been just kind of like piled on and exacerbated. And I think about, people are struggling so much financially, experiencing isolation, like you mentioned, being re-traumatized, like you talked about, David. And so to me, that's felt very heavy and as a challenge that, are we going backwards? How do we kind of dig ourselves out from this? But I think like the optimism in me sees that this is really going to be an opportunity and is an opportunity for communities to kind of lead the way in prevention, for preventionists to advance solutions that maybe were different than what they were doing a couple of years ago, and to think about like what are those new partnerships that are really important to being able to prevent violence.
Yeah, I think that's so important to think about the way you describe that, because, as we know, most communities, the top issue in their mind is not always going to be the sexual or intimate partner violence. And so when you ask people to identify what the problems are they're facing, there's a wide range of pieces. But as we and our partners at Prevention Institute say, a good solution solves multiple problems. I think this gives us an opportunity to be able to do some of this, to be able to do work on building communities, on building that community connectedness, and that those are those opportunities that are going to be able to support our prevention efforts, and not just look at preventing sexual and domestic violence, but also really affecting the underlying drivers of the oppression that are causing these problems from happening in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely, David.
Mm-hmm. What I really appreciate about what you both shared was the importance of not siloing preventing sexual and intimate partner violence away from other facets of people's lives or communities' lives, and how connected this work is to many other challenges and strengths that communities face too. And David, you pulling that quote from our partners over at Prevention Institute about a good solution solves multiple problems makes me think a lot about health equity and how we've seen a more urgent focus on integrating health equity into sexual and intimate partner violence prevention, and specifically with that grounding prevention work in racial justice. What are some examples of how you've seen this come to life in the last year?
There's actually been two pretty recent publications that have come out. One from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and Prevention Institute, and another from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And I think that both of these publications are really important contributions to the ways that we think about sexual and intimate partner violence prevention through a health equity lens. And so, just for example, the NSVRC and Prevention Institute report, it's called A Health Equity Approach to Preventing Sexual Violence. And they do two things that I think are really wonderful in this document. One is that they kind of lift up 5 really specific strategies to advance a health equity approach. And the other thing is that they have specific examples of what those strategies are in practice. And I think that's really helpful when we're trying to figure out, like, okay, that sounds good, I'm on board with it, but what does it actually look like? And then the NRCDV and NSVRC document, it's called Back to Basics, Partnering with Survivors and Communities to Promote Health Equity at the Intersections of Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence. That document does is it really centers health equity and prevention solutions specifically around those most impacted, and in this case, around the needs of Black women survivors. And I think that that's such an important tie to health equity. And we're actually working on doing a web conference with some of the contributors to that document. And I'm just really looking forward to hearing their perspectives on health equity and using a health equity approach to prevention. So those are kind of some of the ways that I've been seeing it come up, Tori. But David, I'm interested in hearing what you've seen.
Well, to me, health equity is only a beginning of it, and it goes beyond that. And it goes beyond how do we actually really promote the issues, to promote efforts that are really going to support social justice efforts. And it's not a coincidence that in this last year, since the pandemic, as we've had a national recognition about racism, and that there's been greater calls for racial justice, and that it's important that we really get involved in that. Our colleagues at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence used for their Domestic Violence Awareness Month theme for the last 2 years, no survivor justice without racial justice. I think that this is a really, sort of a clarion call that I've seen from prevention practitioners around the country. But what I'm also seeing is that there's ways that communities are coming together. And what they're doing is they're going over, that we're going over, and I'm seeing mutual aid efforts that are growing in communities where they're working about how do we as a community come together to meet the needs of our community. I'm seeing greater conversation about how we have to move beyond criminalization as the response to sexual and intimate partner violence. And that what that does is it opens the doors to prevention strategies. That if we see these problems of sexual violence and intimate partner violence as crimes, then we end up thinking the solutions are criminal system solutions. But what we need to do is come up with prevention solutions. And I think that now, as we have these conversations about what are we going to do about policing, what are we going to do about how to be able to engage restorative justice and transformative justice, that these become the opportunities for preventative solutions of how do we move forward. In public health, we use the terms like social determinants of health. But what that basically is saying is it's ways that we're looking at what in our society are those social drivers of violence. And what it's doing is it's forcing us to look at what those drivers are that contribute to violence happening. And so what I'm seeing now is that there's a greater interest to get to those roots, and we're really thinking about the creative energies to be able to do that. And Prevent Connect over this, the last year and a half, we've had a chance to share some of those examples. We've seen some really exciting work. I'm excited to work that Black Women's Blueprint's done around their bystander programs looking at racial justice. I love how Hollaback, that was doing anti-street harassment work, has been moving to how they're also using interventions to be able to increase bystander action against racial justice. Against racial injustice to promote racial justice. And so these are the pieces that I think I'm really seeing as we're going to be able to take ways that we're promoting overall equity. Health equity is just one of those forms of equity.
Thank you both for those responses and for all of those resources that you had shared in your responses too. For our audience, all of the resources that are mentioned on this podcast will be linked on the Prevent Connect website, where you can also find this podcast. And that will be linked on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast on. Thanks for listening. Part 2 is available now wherever you listen to podcasts, and also linked on our website.